The champagne had already been uncorked aboard the flagship of the Galactic Coalition when the first anomaly appeared on the sensors. Admiral Vex Thor of the Krillian Empire stood at the observation deck, his 4 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as fireworks erupted across the fleet in brilliant cascades of color. 50,000 ships strong, the greatest armada ever assembled in the known galaxy, had just crushed the Devourers at the Battle of Kepler's Gate. The war was over. 300 years of bloodshed, of watching worlds burn and civilizations fall to an enemy that knew nothing but hunger and hatred, had finally come to an end. The celebration was not mere revelry. It was the exhale of a galaxy that had held its breath for generations. Vex Thor raised his glass to the assembled dignitaries from 100 worlds. The Sylvari matriarch, her crystalline form refracting the light into 1,000 rainbows, stood beside the towering Gormith war chief, whose people had lost 17 colonies to the Devourer's relentless advance. The Etherian Chancellor, a being of pure energy contained within a diplomatic shell, pulsed with what Vex Thor had learned to recognize as joy. They had all sacrificed so much. They had all earned this moment. The speeches had been endless, each species taking their turn to honor their dead, to proclaim their relief, to speak of rebuilding and renaissance. The war had cost them all dearly, but they had won. The Devourers were broken, their last fortress shattered, their queen mind destroyed. The threat was eliminated. To peace, Vex Thor proclaimed, his voice carrying across the grand hall through translators that rendered his words in 1,000 tongues simultaneously. To the fallen who paved our path to this day, and to the future we will build together, free from fear, free from the shadow of extinction. The assembled leaders raised their vessels in kind, whatever form those vessels took for their particular biology. The moment crystallized. A perfect snapshot of unity, of hope, of triumph earned through rivers of blood and mountains of sacrifice. Then the champagne froze in Vex Thor's throat. The communications officer, a young Krillian named Severus, approached with an expression that Vex Thor had seen too many times during the war. It was the look of someone bearing news that would shatter everything. "Admiral," Severus said quietly, her voice barely audible above the celebration. "We have a situation." Vex Thor set down his glass with deliberate care, his warrior instincts immediately pushing aside the fog of celebration. "Speak plainly, officer." Severus manipulated her wrist-mounted display, and a holographic projection materialized between them. 17 minutes ago, long-range sensors detected massive spatial distortions at the edge of the Kepler's Gate debris field. Initial readings suggested it was residual energy from the battle. However, the distortions are intensifying and moving with purpose. "Admiral, something is coming through." Multiple somethings. The festive atmosphere in the Grand Hall continued unabated, but Vex Thor felt the cold fingers of dread creeping along his spine. "Devourers?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. They had been thorough. They had made certain. Severus shook her head. "No, sir. The energy signatures are completely unknown. Not Devourer. Not any species in the Coalition database. The quantum resonance patterns are. Admiral, I've never seen anything like this." "Whatever's coming, they're using technology that operates on principles we don't understand." Vex Thor's tactical mind raced through possibilities. A hidden Devourer fleet? Impossible. Their intelligence had been impeccable. A new threat emerging while the galaxy was weakened? The timing would be catastrophic but not inconceivable. Or something else entirely, something beyond their current understanding of warfare and technology. "Sound General Alert," Vex Thor commanded, his voice dropping into the tone that had led fleets through countless battles. "Quietly. I want tactical stations manned and shields raised across the fleet without causing panic among the civilians. Route all sensor data to my command station. As Severus moved to execute his orders, Vexthor turned back to the celebration, watching the leaders of the galaxy toast their victory with smiles that would soon fade. He had learned long ago that the universe cared nothing for humanoid sentiment or timing. Threats did not wait for convenient moments. They struck when they struck, indifferent to celebration or mourning. Within minutes, Vexthor stood at his command station, the holographic display showing the Kepler's gate system in stunning detail. The debris field from the battle still glowed with residual heat, twisted metal, and shattered hulls, forming a graveyard that stretched across millions of kilometers. And there, at the edge of sensor range, space itself was tearing open. Not the gentle ripples of standard faster-than-light travel, but violent ruptures in the fabric of reality, as if something massive was forcing its way through dimensional barriers that should not be crossed. The distortions coalesced into stable wormholes, and through those impossible apertures, shapes began to emerge. They came slowly at first, their forms resolving on the sensors like nightmares gaining substance. Ships, but not like any ships the Coalition had ever encountered. Where Coalition vessels curved and flowed with organic aesthetics or geometric precision depending on their creators, these new arrivals were brutal in their simplicity. They were wedge-shaped mountains of armor and weaponry, their hulls dark as the void between stars, their surfaces bristling with weapons systems that made Coalition battleships look like ceremonial yachts. Each one dwarfed even the largest Coalition dreadnoughts, their mass readings causing the sensors to recalibrate multiple times as if unable to believe their own data. "By the Founders," Severus whispered, her voice trembling. "Admiral, initial scans indicate those vessels are operating at 73% of their total mass capacity. They're running dark, sir. Minimal power signatures. They're not even trying." Vexthor felt something he had rarely experienced in 3 centuries of warfare, genuine fear. Not for himself, but for every living being in the fleet, for every civilian celebrating their survival, for the galaxy that thought it had just won its freedom. "How many?" he asked. The answer came not from Severus, but from the tactical AI, its emotionless voice somehow making the words more terrifying. "Current count, 47 capital-class vessels and increasing. Estimated full deployment, unknown." The celebration in the Grand Hall continued for exactly 47 more seconds before Vexthor made the decision that protocol demanded. The general alert klaxon shattered the festive atmosphere like a hammer through crystal, their wailing cry cutting through music and laughter with brutal efficiency. The transformation was instantaneous. Trained military officers across 100 species dropped their drinks and sprinted to their stations, while civilian dignitaries froze in confusion and rising terror. The Gormith warchief was already moving, his massive frame clearing a path to the command deck. The Sylvari matriarch's crystalline form shifted from celebratory gold to tactical blue, her species' emotional states visible in their chromatic changes. Even the Etherean Chancellor abandoned the pretense of calm, its energy field crackling with barely contained anxiety. Vexthor stood before the main holographic display as the Coalition leadership assembled around him, their faces reflecting the same question. How could this be happening now, at the moment of their greatest triumph? The display showed the newcomer fleet in terrible detail. Each vessel a monument to destructive capability, each one broadcasting power signatures that suggested they were merely coasting, their true potential still locked away behind deliberate restraint. "What are we looking at, Admiral?" the Gormith warchief rumbled, his battle-scarred hands already moving to check his personal armaments out of pure instinct. Vexthor had commanded fleets for longer than some species had possessed spaceflight, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Those instincts were screaming now. "Unknown contacts," Vexthor replied, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. 47 capital ships and counting, emerging from artificially generated wormholes at the edge of the debris field. Technology beyond our current understanding. No response to hailing frequencies. No identification signatures in any known database. He paused, letting that sink in. They appeared 17 minutes after our final victory broadcast was transmitted across all frequencies. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. The Sylvari matriarch's color shifted to deep violet, the shade of profound concern. You believe they were waiting? Watching? Vexthor nodded grimly. The timing is too precise to be coincidence. They waited until we had committed everything to the battle against the Devourers. They waited until we were weakened, exhausted, celebrating. The tactical display updated, and a new voice cut across the command deck. The resonant, artificial tones of the Coalition's central AI. Admiral, the unknown vessels are broadcasting on all frequencies. Signal origin, lead vessel. Nature, wide spectrum announcement. Translation matrix engaged. For a moment, there was only static, the kind that made evolutionary hindbrains scream warnings of danger. Then a voice emerged, and it spoke in flawless galactic standard, the neutral tongue adopted by the Coalition for diplomatic purposes. But beneath the words was something else, an accent, a cadence, a quality that set every translator system struggling to place its origin. It was a voice that carried weight, authority, and something that Vexthor realized with a start was profound disappointment. Attention Coalition forces, the voice began, and it was male, though the gender conventions of the species remained unknown. This is Captain Marcus Chen of the United Earth Space Command, commanding the 1st Expeditionary Fleet. We received your distress beacon 300 standard years ago. We came as fast as we could. The command deck erupted into chaos. Earth? The word meant nothing to most species, just another designation for an uncontacted world somewhere in the vast darkness. But the implications of the message hit Vexthor like a physical blow. 300 years. The exact duration of the war against the Devourers. These newcomers, these humans, had been traveling for 3 centuries to answer a call for help that the galaxy had forgotten it had sent. The Etherian Chancellor pulsed with urgent energy. 300 years ago, at the beginning of the Devourer War, the Coalition sent out a general distress call to all quadrants, including unmapped space. It was a desperate measure. We never received any responses. We assumed. The Chancellor trailed off, unable to finish the thought. They had assumed they were alone. They had assumed no help was coming. They had assumed they would stand or fall by their own strength. And they had stood at terrible cost, and they had triumphed. But these humans had been coming all along, crossing distances that would have broken lesser species, enduring a journey that spanned generations. "Sir," Severus reported, her voice tight with tension, "tactical analysis of the human vessels is complete. Admiral, those ships are designed for one purpose only: war. Every square meter of their hulls is optimized for combat efficiency. Their weapon systems operate on principles our scientists are calling aggressively kinetic. They're mounting rail guns, Admiral. Enormous ones. And something else, energy weapons that our sensors can't properly categorize. The power output readings are..." "They're impossible, sir. By our understanding of physics, those reactors shouldn't be stable." Vexthor studied the human dreadnoughts with a warrior's eye, seeing what the sensors could not tell him. There was no elegance in those vessels, no artistic expression or cultural statement. They were weapons, pure and simple, built by a species that had looked at the darkness between stars and decided that firepower was the only appropriate response. The humans had received a distress call from a civilization they had never met, speaking languages they didn't know, and they had spent 300 years crossing the void to help. What kind of species did that? What kind of beings committed generations to aiding strangers? Captain Chen's voice continued, and now Vex Thor could hear the fatigue in it, the weight of centuries carried in every syllable. We've been monitoring your communications for the past 3 standard days as we approach the system. We understand that you've achieved victory against the threat you call the Devourers. We understand that our arrival is unexpected, but we need you to understand something crucial. There was a pause, and Vex Thor felt his tactical instincts screaming warnings. Our scans of the battlefield show incomplete destruction of the Devourer biosignatures. Your celebration is premature. They're not dead, they're adapting. And they're regrouping in the asteroid field at coordinates we're now transmitting to your command structure. The command deck went silent as death. Severus frantically worked her console, redirecting deep space sensors to the coordinates the humans had provided. Long seconds passed, seconds that felt like hours, before her face went pale beneath her Krillian features. "Admiral," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Confirmed. Devourer biosignatures detected." They're rebuilding!" The Queen Mind wasn't destroyed, it fragmented. It's been regenerating in the asteroid field while we celebrated. Estimated time to full combat capability, 6 hours. The champagne glasses forgotten on tables across the fleet suddenly seemed like monuments to arrogance, to the fatal assumption that victory could ever be clean or complete. The Gormith war chief let out a roar of anguish and rage that echoed through the command deck. "Impossible! We destroyed their fortress! We watched it burn!" But Vex Thor knew better. He had fought the Devourers long enough to know that they were survivors on a level that defied conventional extinction. They were life reduced to its most fundamental imperative: persist, consume, expand. They didn't have civilization or culture or anything resembling mercy. They were hunger given form, evolution stripped of everything but the will to continue. Of course they had survived. Of course they had hidden. Of course they had waited for the coalition to lower its guard. Captain Chen's voice returned, and now there was something else in it, something that made Vex Thor's warrior soul recognize a kindred spirit across the vast gulf of space and species. "We understand you're exhausted. We understand you've given everything to this war. But if you'll permit us, if you'll trust us, the first expeditionary fleet stands ready to engage the enemy. We didn't cross 300 years of void to arrive too late. We won't let that happen." There was a sound in the background of the transmission, a rhythmic pounding that Vex Thor's translator struggled to identify before labeling it as human war drums, a ceremonial preparation for battle that apparently predated their spaceflight by millennia. Vex Thor looked around at the assembled coalition leadership, seeing in their faces the same desperate hope and terrible exhaustion that he felt in his own bones. They had nothing left to give. The fleet was running on fumes and courage, held together by determination and the desperate joy of believed victory. If they had to fight again now, they would lose. They would break. The galaxy would fall. But these humans, these strangers who had traveled for 3 centuries to answer a cry for help, they were fresh. They were ready. They were offering salvation to a galaxy that had thought it had already saved itself. "Captain Chen," Vex Thor said, his voice carrying across the void through subspace communicators, "the Coalition accepts your offer of assistance with gratitude beyond words. But I must ask, why? You owe us nothing. You crossed unimaginable distances for people you've never met. Your people endured generations of travel for strangers. Why?" There was a long pause, and Vex Thor could almost see the human captain considering his words. When the response came, it was simple, direct, and somehow perfectly aligned with the brutal efficiency of those dreadnought designs. "Because you asked for help, Admiral. And because we're human. It's what we do." The human fleet moved with a precision that defied their apparent bulk, those massive dreadnoughts accelerating toward the asteroid field with a grace that seemed impossible for vessels of their size. Vexthor watched on the tactical display as they deployed into a formation that his 3 centuries of military experience couldn't immediately categorize. It was neither the defensive shell that most species favored nor the aggressive wedge of the Gormith, but something else entirely. Something that suggested these humans had spent their 300-year journey doing more than just traveling. They had been preparing, studying, evolving their doctrine in the darkness between stars. "Sir!" Severus called out, her voice carrying a note of professional amazement that broke through her earlier fear. "The human vessels are sharing their tactical network with us. Admiral, they're opening their entire sensor suite to Coalition Command. Full transparency. They're trusting us with complete access to their capabilities." Vexthor felt something shift in his chest. In warfare, information was survival. Species guarded their technological capabilities jealously, even among allies, because today's friend could be tomorrow's rival. The humans were broadcasting their strengths and weaknesses to a coalition they had never met, making themselves vulnerable in the name of operational efficiency. It was either the most foolish thing Vexthor had ever witnessed, or the most noble. The shared data flooded into coalition systems, and what it revealed made Vexthor's tactical officers gasp in unified shock. The human dreadnoughts weren't just powerful, they were redundant in ways that spoke to a philosophy of warfare that bordered on paranoid. Every critical system had 3 backups. Every weapon had 2 alternate firing solutions. Their armor was layered in materials that the Coalition had theoretical papers about, but had never successfully manufactured at scale. And their crew complements, Vexthor had to read the numbers twice to believe them. Each dreadnought carried 50,000 humans. Not soldiers alone, but complete communities. Families. Children. Scientists. Artists. The humans hadn't just sent a military fleet. They had sent their civilization. "They traveled for 300 years, the Sovari matriarch said softly, her crystalline form pulsing with comprehension and something that might have been awe. "Multiple generations born and died in the void, never seeing a planet, never knowing if they would arrive in time. They turned their warships into arks, preserving their culture while preparing for war. What kind of species commits to such a journey?" The Gormith warchief rumbled thoughtfully. "A species that takes promises seriously. A species that doesn't abandon allies, even allies they've never met." He paused, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "A species we would do well to befriend if we survive this day." Captain Chen's voice returned to the communications channel, but this time it was joined by others. A chorus of human voices speaking different languages that the translators struggled to parse before rendering them in Galactic Standard. "All vessels, this is Fleet Command. Target packages are being distributed now. We're tagging Devourer positions in the asteroid field based on our long-range bioscans. Primary objective: prevent the Queen Mine from achieving critical mass regeneration. Secondary objective: complete eradication of all Devourer biomass in this system. Tertiary objective: keep Coalition forces safe while they recover and regroup. Remember your training. Remember why we came. And remember that 300 years ago, someone out here needed help. Today, we answer that call. All hands to battle stations. May Earth remember our names." The human battle cry that followed wasn't translated. It came in dozens of languages simultaneously, a cacophony of human culture expressing the same fundamental sentiment in hundreds of ways. Vexthor didn't need translation. He recognized the sound of warriors preparing their souls for what came next. He had heard similar cries from every species in the Coalition, that primal roar of defiance against darkness and death. It was universal, transcendent, the sound of sapient beings refusing to go quietly into extinction. The humans had their own version, and it echoed across the void with the weight of 300 years of preparation behind it. The first human weapons spoke with voices that made Vex Thor's sensors scream warnings. The railguns, those, aggressively kinetic, weapons that Severus had identified, launched projectiles at velocities that shouldn't have been possible without tearing the weapons themselves apart. But the humans had solved that problem somehow, and now tungsten slugs the size of Coalition shuttlecraft ripped through space at percentages of light speed that made conventional evasion impossible. They hit the asteroid field with impacts that registered on seismic sensors, vaporizing stone and hidden devourer biomass alike in explosions that briefly birthed new suns in the darkness. But it was the energy weapons that truly demonstrated human innovation. They called them Lance batteries, and they operated on principles that Coalition scientists would spend decades trying to understand. Focused particle beams that didn't dissipate over distance like conventional energy weapons, but seemed to intensify, drawing power from the vacuum itself through quantum manipulation that bordered on violation of thermodynamic laws. Where they struck, matter ceased to exist in any conventional sense, not vaporized or blown apart, but fundamentally unmade at the atomic level. The devourers, organisms that could survive almost anything through rapid adaptation, found themselves facing weapons that left nothing to adapt to. "Sir," Severus reported, her voice carrying equal parts terror and exhilaration, "the devourers are attempting to swarm the human vessels. Standard doctrine, overwhelmed with numbers and biomass boarding pods." Vex Thor had seen this tactic succeed against Coalition ships more times than he cared to remember. The devourers would launch living projectiles, organisms bred for suicide impacts that could burrow through armor and flood a ship with ravenous bioforms that consumed crew and vessel alike. It was nightmare warfare, the kind that left survivors unable to sleep without sedation. He almost called out a warning to the humans, but the words died in his throat as he watched their response. The human point defense systems lit up the void like a thunderstorm given form. Thousands of automated weapons tracked the incoming devourer pods with precision that suggested artificial intelligence far beyond Coalition standards. But what truly shocked Vex Thor was the integration. The human ships didn't just defend themselves individually, they created overlapping fields of fire that covered each other with calculated efficiency. Not a single devourer pod penetrated the defensive screen. Not one. They were reduced to component atoms before they crossed half the distance to their targets, and the humans hadn't even needed to slow their advance. Captain Chen's voice cut through the tactical channel with calm authority that suggested this was exactly what he'd expected. "Coalition Command, be advised. We're detecting deep structure devourer formations attempting to flank our position using the asteroid field's magnetic shadows. They're trying to hit you while we're engaged forward. Recommend you maintain defensive posture and let us handle the intercept. Sending tactical packages to your fleet commanders now." Vex Thor pulled up the data and felt his blood run cold. The humans were right. The devourers were attempting a pincer movement, using tactics that suggested the Queen Mind was already recovering cognitive function. If the Coalition had been alone, they would have been caught between two forces with depleted munitions and exhausted crews. But they weren't alone. The human dreadnoughts split their formation with mechanical precision, half maintaining pressure on the primary devourer concentration while the other half pivoted to intercept the flanking force. The maneuver should have been impossible for vessels that massive, but the humans executed it flawlessly, their engines burning with such intensity that the heat signatures were visible across the electromagnetic spectrum. Vex Thor realized he was watching something he'd never seen before. A military force that had been training for this specific type of warfare for 300 years, refining doctrine and tactics with each generation, preparing for a fight they weren't sure they'd live to see. The second engagement was shorter than the first, but no less brutal. The flanking Devourer force ran into a wall of human firepower that left no room for survival or retreat. The railguns spoke again, their projectiles timed with such precision that they created overlapping kill zones where escape was mathematically impossible. The Lance batteries carved through Devourer bioships like burning wire through flesh, leaving trails of dissociated atoms where moments before there had been living tissue bent on destruction. And through it all, the humans broadcast tactical data to the coalition forces, sharing every sensor reading, every firing solution, every piece of intelligence, as if the coalition were trusted comrades rather than strangers met in the crucible of desperate battle. "Admiral," the Gormith war chief said quietly, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller, as he watched the human efficiency in dealing death. "I have fought in 3,000 engagements across 2 centuries of war. I have never seen anything like this. They're not just fighting, they're executing a doctrine that's been refined across generations. Every movement is deliberate. Every shot is calculated. They're not angry or afraid or desperate. They're professional." As if this is simply what they do. As if genocide against an implacable foe is just another day's work. Vexthor understood what the war chief was struggling to articulate. The humans fought with a cold efficiency that was somehow more terrifying than the Devourer's mindless hunger. They weren't cruel. Every action was measured, necessary, designed to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. But there was no hesitation, no quarter offered, no moment of doubt. They had come across 300 years of void to fight an enemy they'd never seen, and now they were systematically erasing that enemy from existence with the same calm focus that others might apply to mathematics or meditation. It spoke to a species that had looked at the necessity of violence and decided to master it completely rather than flinch from it. The battle, if it could be called that, when one side held such overwhelming advantage, lasted 47 minutes. In that time, the human First Expeditionary Fleet eliminated every trace of Devourer presence in the Kepler's gate system, using sensor technology sophisticated enough to detect individual biosignatures, and weapons powerful enough to eliminate them at the molecular level. They left nothing to chance, nothing to regenerate, nothing to adapt. When Captain Chen finally called the ceasefire, the tactical display showed a system scrubbed clean of the threat that had haunted the galaxy for 3 centuries. "Coalition Command, this is Captain Chen. Battlefield is secure. All Devourer biomass has been neutralized. We're conducting final verification sweeps now, and we'll maintain patrol patterns for the next 72 hours to ensure complete elimination. Your people should stand down and begin recovery operations. You've earned your rest." There was a pause, and then the human captain added something that made Vexthor's throat tighten. With emotion, he thought 3 centuries of war had burned away. "And Admiral Vexthor? On behalf of the United Earth Space Command and all the humans who made this journey, we're sorry we couldn't arrive sooner. We're sorry you had to fight alone for so long. But we're here now, and we're not leaving until we're sure you're safe." The aftermath of battle settled over the fleet like a blanket, but this time it was different from the celebrations that had preceded the human arrival. This time, there was genuine peace, not the desperate hope of believed victory, but the solid certainty of confirmed survival. Vexthor stood at his observation deck, watching as the human dreadnoughts maintained their patrol patterns with tireless vigilance, their sensors sweeping the system in overlapping grids that left no shadow unchecked. They had been fighting for 47 minutes. The coalition had been fighting for 300 years. Yet it was the humans who insisted on standing watch while the exhausted coalition forces stood down. The diplomatic requests began flooding in within the hour. Every species in the coalition wanted to meet these humans, to understand the beings who had crossed the void for strangers, to establish relations with a civilization that demonstrated such overwhelming military capability paired with apparent altruism. But Captain Chen politely deferred all meetings for 12 hours, insisting that coalition personnel needed rest before any formal interactions. Even in this, Vexthor noted, the humans demonstrated an understanding of warfare's toll that spoke to experience. They knew that exhausted soldiers made poor diplomats, and that genuine friendship couldn't be built on the foundation of mutual desperation. Instead, the humans sent something else: medical teams. The request came through official channels, carefully worded to avoid any implication of inadequacy in coalition medical capabilities. But the offer was clear. Human doctors had studied coalition biology during their 300-year journey, using the information embedded in the original distress call and subsequent intelligence gathering. They had specialists who understood Krillian physiology, Sylvari crystalline structures, Gormith metabolic systems, and 100 other species' medical needs. They offered their services not as conquerors or saviors, but as colleagues, as fellow sapients who understood that war wounded more than just bodies. Vexthor authorized the medical exchange, and what followed gave him deeper insight into human nature than any tactical display could provide. The human medical teams arrived in small shuttles, unarmed except for the medical equipment they carried. They wore uniforms that clearly identified them as non-combatants, and they approached coalition wounded with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the brutal efficiency their warships had displayed. They treated Krillian soldiers with compound fractures, Sylvari whose crystalline structures had been shattered by devourer bioweapons, Gormith suffering from radiation poisoning. And they did it with practiced skill that spoke to generations of accumulated medical knowledge. But what struck Vexthor most profoundly was watching a human doctor, a female named Dr. Sarah Park, according to her identification, work on a young Krillian soldier who had lost 2 of her 4 arms in the earlier battle against the Devourers. Dr. Park's hands moved with precision as she stabilized the wounds, her voice soft and reassuring despite the language barrier that translators struggled to fully bridge. "You're going to be okay," she said, repeating it like a mantra. "You fought bravely. You protected your people. Now let us protect you. Let us help." And the young soldier, who had been stoic through the initial treatment, broke down crying tears that Krillian biology only produced under extreme emotional distress. Severus, who had been observing the medical operations, approached Vexthor with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Admiral, I've been analyzing the human medical equipment. Sir, some of their technology is 300 years old by our standards. It predates their journey. But they've maintained it, improved it, adapted it. And the doctors themselves. Admiral, Dr. Park is 4th generation. Her great-grandmother was on the original crew that left Earth. She was born in the void, trained in the void, and she's dedicated her entire life to preparing to treat species she'd never met. She practiced surgery on virtual models of our anatomy for decades before ever seeing an actual Krillian. They all did. Every human doctor, every specialist. They prepared for this day their entire lives. The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just sent a military fleet. They had sent a multi-generational commitment to a promise made by ancestors long dead. The original crew who left Earth in response to the distress call knew they would never see the destination. Their children knew the same. And their children's children. Yet each generation had maintained the mission, refining their skills, preparing for a war they might not live to fight, against an enemy they knew only through transmitted data. It was a level of cultural dedication that Vexthor struggled to comprehend. Captain Chen finally agreed to a meeting 18 hours after the battle, once Coalition Command staff had been given time to rest and process. Vexthor assembled the coalition leadership in a conference chamber hastily cleared of celebration debris, a reminder of how quickly their certain victory had transformed into desperate salvation. The human captain arrived via shuttle, accompanied by a small diplomatic team and a security detail that was clearly ceremonial rather than practical. If the humans had wanted to take hostile action, Vexthor knew, a few guards wouldn't matter against their dreadnoughts. The man who walked into the conference chamber was not what Vexthor had expected. Captain Marcus Chen was human standard middle-aged, his features suggesting East Asian ancestry according to the cultural database that Vexthor had frantically reviewed. He wore a uniform that was functional rather than decorative, dark blue with minimal insignia, designed for duty rather than display. But it was his eyes that caught Vexthor's attention. They carried the weight of command, the burden of responsibility, and something else. A profound sadness that came from being born to fight a war that had started before his ancestors left their homeworld. "Admiral Vexthor," Chen said, his galactic standard perfect but carrying that strange accent that translators still struggle to place. "On behalf of the United Earth Space Command and all of humanity, I thank you for your hospitality and for trusting us in battle. I know our arrival was unconventional." Vexthor made the Krillian gesture of respect between equals, a subtle positioning of his four arms that Chen's cultural briefing must have covered because he responded with a human gesture. A slight bow from the waist that his research suggested was a sign of mutual respect in many Earth cultures. "Captain Chen," Vexthor replied, "words seem insufficient to express the Coalition's gratitude. You answered a call for help that we had forgotten we sent. You traveled for 300 years to aid strangers. You arrived at our darkest moment and turned certain defeat into absolute victory. How does a civilization repay such a debt?" Chen smiled, and it was a weary expression that carried the weight of those 3 centuries. "You don't repay it, Admiral. That's not why we came. We came because someone asked for help, and humanity has learned, through our own bitter history, that civilization survives only when we help each other. When we received your distress call, we were a younger species, barely unified, still healing from our own wars. But we recognized that call for what it was. A chance to be better than our history suggested we could be." The Sylvari matriarch, her crystalline form shifting through colors that suggested deep contemplation, spoke with a voice like wind chimes. "Captain, our xenopsychologists are struggling to understand your species' motivation. You committed generational resources to helping strangers. Your people were born, lived, and died in the void, never seeing the fruition of their purpose. How did you maintain such dedication across so many generations? How did you prevent the mission from being abandoned when the original crew died?" Chen turned to face the matriarch directly, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Because we taught our children why they were traveling. Every generation, we told the story of the Coalition's distress call. Every child born on those ships grew up knowing that somewhere out here, people needed help. We made it part of our culture, our identity. To be human became synonymous with answering that call. We couldn't save ourselves from our own worst impulses. We nearly destroyed ourselves in nuclear fire before we achieved true spaceflight. But we could save others. We could be the help that we wished had existed during our own darkest hours." The Gormath war chief leaned forward, his massive bulk making the furniture creak. "But your weapons, your tactics, these speak to a species that knows war intimately. You fight with a professionalism that suggests extensive combat experience. How does a species prepare for war across 3 centuries without fighting?" Chen's expression grew darker, shadows crossing his features like clouds over a sun. "Who said we didn't fight, War Chief? The journey was 300 years long. We faced radiation storms, cosmic hazards, malfunctions that killed hundreds. and we fought each other. Humans are fractious by nature. We carried our conflicts into the void with us. The first century of the journey saw rebellions, mutinies, ideological splits that nearly tore the fleet apart. He paused, and Vex Thor could see the ghosts of that history haunting him. We learned to fight in the void, War Chief. We learned that survival required unity, and unity required sometimes defending ourselves from our own worst impulses. By the 2nd century, we had developed doctrine, discipline, protocols. By the 3rd century, we had transformed ourselves from refugees fleeing our own violence into a military force capable of fighting on behalf of others. We didn't just travel for 300 years, we evolved. And every generation, we remembered why. We remembered that at the end of this journey, someone needed our help. The Etherian Chancellor pulsed with curious energy. And when you arrived to find we had already won? When you saw us celebrating victory? What did your people feel? Chen's smile was sad but genuine. Relief, Chancellor. Profound relief. We were thrilled that you had survived, that you had found the strength to save yourselves. The fact that you still needed us, that the Devourers had survived, that was almost a blessing, in a way. It meant our journey had purpose. It meant the 300 years, the generations born and died in the void, it all mattered. We arrived in time to help, even if just barely. Vex Thor felt something shift in the conference chamber, a sense of connection forming between species separated by vast gulfs of evolution and culture. Captain, the Coalition owes humanity a debt we cannot repay. But we can offer friendship, alliance, and partnership. We can offer you a place in the galaxy you cross to reach. What does Earth want from the stars? Chen looked around the conference chamber, meeting the eyes of beings from 100 worlds, and his answer was simple, profound, and somehow perfectly human. Just to help, Admiral. Just to be part of something larger than ourselves. We came to answer a distress call, but we'd like to stay as friends. The integration of humanity into the Galactic Coalition didn't happen overnight, but it happened with a speed that surprised the bureaucrats who specialized in first contact protocols. The humans had earned their place not through diplomatic maneuvering, but through the most fundamental currency of interstellar civilization. They had bled for the galaxy before they'd ever been recognized as part of it. Within a week, emergency protocols were bypassed, provisional membership was granted, and the United Earth Space Command became the newest member of the coalition, with full voting rights and a seat on the Security Council that no one dared challenge. But with integration came revelations that transformed humanity from mysterious saviors into complex partners. The full story of their journey emerged through shared databases and cultural exchanges, and what it revealed was both inspiring and sobering. Earth, it turned out, had been a divided world when the Coalition's distress call arrived. Nations still existed as separate entities. Old grudges and territorial disputes simmered beneath a fragile global peace. The decision to answer the call had been hotly debated, with many arguing that humanity couldn't afford to waste resources on strangers when their own world still struggled with inequality, climate damage, and the scars of previous wars. But a coalition of Earth nations, led by those who had survived their own genocides and understood the moral imperative of intervention, had pooled resources to build the first expeditionary fleet. They had sent their best and brightest, their most idealistic and dedicated, knowing that those people would never return home. The ships had launched with great fanfare, with billions watching and hoping that humanity was taking its first step toward becoming something better than its violent history suggested. And then, for 300 years, Earth had heard nothing. The fleet had vanished into the void, communications limited by the vast distances, and the need to maintain radio silence to avoid attracting potential hostiles. Dr. Sarah Park, who had become an unexpected ambassador through her medical work, shared the personal side of that history during a cultural exchange program. My great-grandmother, Dr. Michelle Park, was a trauma surgeon from Seoul. She volunteered for the fleet because she had seen what war did to children during the Pacific conflicts. She wanted to help prevent that suffering for others, even if those others weren't human. She died when I was 5, but she made sure I knew the mission. She told me, Sarah, we're not traveling to conquer or claim. We're traveling to help. Remember that. Make sure your children remember that. And I did. And they will. The human fleet, it turned out, wasn't just 47 dreadnoughts. Those were merely the military component, designed to engage the Devourers based on intelligence from the distress call. Behind them, still traveling at sublight speeds, was a civilian convoy, generation ships carrying 2 million humans, who were prepared to help rebuild whatever they found at the end of the journey. Agricultural specialists, architects, teachers, artists, engineers. An entire cross-section of human civilization committed to providing long-term assistance to a coalition they'd never met. They wouldn't arrive for another 50 years, but they were coming, had been coming for 3 centuries, driven by a promise made by ancestors they'd never known. Vexthor found himself spending long hours with Captain Chin, discussing everything from military tactics to philosophy. During one such conversation, held in the observation deck of the human flagship USC Endurance, he finally asked the question that had been haunting him. Captain, I've studied your species' history through your shared databases. Humans have fought wars almost continuously throughout your recorded civilization. You've weaponized everything from sticks to atomic energy. Your own people have committed atrocities against each other that rival anything the Devourers did. How did a species like that produce a mission like this? Chin stood at the viewport, looking out at the stars that had been his entire world, his expression distant. Because we learned, Admiral. We learned through the worst kind of education, by experiencing the consequences of our own cruelty. The 20th century alone, we killed hundreds of millions of our own people in wars, genocides, and famines caused by political ideology. We developed weapons that could sterilize our entire planet. We came within minutes of using them on multiple occasions. And then, somehow, we pulled back from the brink. We looked at what we had become and decided we had to be better. He turned to face Vexthor, and his eyes held the accumulated pain of centuries of human history. The distress call arrived at a crucial moment in our development. We had just survived our closest brush with self-annihilation. We had finally achieved fragile global peace. And suddenly, here was a chance to prove that we could use our capacity for violence in defense of others rather than against ourselves. The debates were fierce. Some argued we should focus on fixing Earth's problems first. But others recognized that becoming a species that helped strangers was exactly how we fixed Earth's problems. We needed a purpose larger than our own survival. The Sylvari matriarch, who had joined them for the conversation, chimed softly. So you weaponized your capacity for violence, but channeled it toward protection rather than aggression. You took the darkness in your nature and forced it to serve the light. Chin nodded slowly. That's one way to put it. We recognize that violence is a tool, and tools are neutral. It's the purpose that matters. We built these dreadnoughts not to conquer, but to defend. We trained for 300 years not to dominate, but to protect. We crossed the void not to claim territory, but to fulfill a promise. And in doing so, we became something better than we were when we started. The integration brought practical benefits beyond military power. Human technology, refined across 3 centuries of void travel, offered solutions to problems the Coalition had struggled with for generations. Their recycling systems, necessary for survival on generation ships, could be adapted to restore war-damaged worlds. Their psychological support frameworks, developed to prevent the despair that came from void-born existences, helped coalition soldiers suffering from 3 centuries of warfare trauma. Their educational systems, designed to maintain cultural knowledge across generations, who would never see its application, offered models for rebuilding civilizations shattered by the Devourers. But perhaps most valuable was the human perspective itself. The view from a species that had been violent, had recognized its capacity for destruction, and had consciously chosen a different path. During a coalition-wide conference on post-war reconstruction, a human sociologist named Dr. James Okonkwo gave a presentation that would be studied for generations. "You've won a war against an external threat," he said, his voice carrying the accent of West Africa filtered through 3 centuries of linguistic drift. "But you haven't yet won the peace." The Devourers were terrifying because they were simple. They consumed, and you fought to survive. But now you face the harder challenge, building a lasting peace among different species with different needs, different cultures, different values. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Humanity spent 10,000 years failing at this. We built empires that collapsed, alliances that shattered, peace treaties that lasted less than a generation. We failed again and again. But each failure taught us something, and the distress call gave us a chance to apply those lessons. We learned that lasting peace requires more than just the absence of war. It requires genuine investment in each other's well-being. It requires seeing strangers not as potential threats, but as potential friends. It requires the same commitment to helping each other in peacetime that you showed in fighting together during war." The reconstruction efforts began almost immediately, with human engineering teams working alongside coalition specialists to rebuild shattered worlds. The human approach was different from coalition standards. Where coalition species often tried to restore things exactly as they had been before the war, humans advocated for improvement. "Why rebuild something that was merely adequate?" asked a human civil engineer named Maria Santos, as she surveyed the ruins of a Krillian colony world. "Why not take this opportunity to make something better? To learn from the past and build for a better future?" It was a philosophy born from Earth's own history of rebuilding after devastation, and it resonated with coalition species tired of simply surviving and ready to thrive. Human architects worked with Sylvari designers to create buildings that blended organic crystal growth with structural efficiency. Human agricultural specialists collaborated with gourmet farmers to develop crops that could grow in radiation-scarred soil. Human psychologists partnered with Etherian counselors to develop trauma treatment programs that honored each species' unique emotional needs while drawing on universal principles of healing. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler's Gate, Vex Thor attended a ceremony on one of the rebuilt colony worlds, a planet that had been scoured by Devourer bioweapons and written off as uninhabitable for centuries. Human terraforming technology, combined with coalition biological expertise, had restored the world to habitability in less than a standard year. The ceremony was attended by thousands of refugees who had thought they would never see their homeworld again, along with the human and coalition workers who had made their return possible. Captain Chen stood beside Vex Thor as they watched families walk across soil that had been sterile rock just months before, children laughing and playing in gardens that shouldn't have existed. "This," Chen said quietly, "this is why we came. Not just the battle, though that mattered, but this. The chance to turn devastation back into life. The chance to help people go home. This makes the 300 years worth it." Vex Thor, who had thought 3 centuries of war had burned away his capacity for tears, found his eyes wet despite himself. The human civilian convoy was still decades away, but preparations were already beginning to welcome them. The coalition had designated a cluster of worlds in a resource-rich system as humanity's official territory, a home in the stars to replace the Earth they had left behind centuries ago. But in typical human fashion, The response from the convoy's leadership was to accept the generous gift, while immediately offering to share it with displaced coalition refugees who had lost their own worlds to the Devourers. "We didn't cross 300 years to claim territory," the convoy's commander transmitted across the vast distance. "We crossed it to be part of something larger. We'll build our home, but we'll share it with anyone who needs shelter." Dr. Park, who had become Vex Thor's regular lunch companion during joint medical conferences, explained the human perspective over a meal that attempted to bridge Krillian and human culinary traditions with mixed success. "Admiral, you have to understand, Earth was dying when we left. Climate change, resource depletion, the scars of old wars. We loved it, but we knew we were part of the problem. This journey was a chance to become better. Every generation that was born in the void, we raised them with the understanding that home wasn't a place we were traveling to. It was a promise we were trying to fulfill. The promise that humanity could be better than its worst impulses. That we could be builders instead of destroyers. That we could help instead of hurt. The final revelation about humanity came from an unexpected source, the human children. The Coalition had been careful about allowing human youth to interact with other species, concerned about cultural contamination or misunderstandings. But when the barriers finally came down, what emerged was a generation of humans who had been raised specifically to understand and value other species. They spoke Galactic Standard from childhood, alongside their heritage languages. They studied Krillian history, Silvari art, Gormith philosophy. They had been prepared not just to fight for the Coalition, but to live with it, to become part of it, to build friendships that would last across lifetimes. A young human girl named Aisha Chen, no relation to the captain despite sharing a common surname, became friends with Severus's daughter, a young Krillian named Revsis. Watching them play together, using a mixture of languages and gestures that transcended species barriers, Vex Thor realized what humanity's true gift to the galaxy might be. Not their weapons, not their technology, but their capacity to imagine a better future and commit everything to achieving it. They had spent 300 years teaching their children to love species they'd never met, to prepare for friendships with beings they might never encounter, to dedicate their lives to a promise made by ancestors long dead. 1 year after the battle, the Coalition held a formal commemoration ceremony. It was intended to honor the fallen from 3 centuries of war, but it became something more, a celebration of survival, of newfound friendship, of hope for the future. Representatives from every Coalition species attended, along with the entire human expeditionary fleet. Captain Chen was awarded the Coalition's highest honor, the Star of Valor, for his actions at Kepler's Gate. But in his acceptance speech, he deflected the honor to every human who had made the journey, living and dead, and to the Coalition forces who had held the line for 3 centuries. "We came here as strangers," Chen said, his voice broadcast across 1,000 worlds, answering a call for help from people we didn't know. "We expected to arrive and fight alongside you, to bleed with you, perhaps to die with you. What we didn't expect was to arrive and find friends. We didn't expect to find peoples who had survived 300 years of hell and emerged still committed to peace, still willing to build rather than destroy, still able to celebrate joy despite the weight of their grief. You honor us with your friendship. You inspire us with your resilience. And you remind us why we made this journey." He paused, and Vex Thor could see the emotion breaking through his professional composure. "My great-great-grandfather, Marcus Chen I, was on the original crew that left Earth. He never saw his homeworld again. He died in the void, having given his life to a promise he would never see fulfilled. But he left me, he left all of us, a legacy. He left us the understanding that promises matter, that helping strangers is the foundation of civilization, that the measure of a species is not in its capacity for destruction, but in its willingness to sacrifice for others. Today, I like to think he's watching from wherever the honored dead go, and he's proud. Not because we arrived in time to fire a few shots at your enemies, but because we arrived in time to become your friends. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence that stretched across the galaxy, billions of beings from hundreds of species pausing to remember the cost of survival and the value of friendship. And then, in a tradition that surprised everyone, the humans began to sing. It started with the crew of the Endurance, Captain Chen's voice joining with his officers, and it spread across the fleet until 47 dreadnoughts full of humans were singing together. The song was ancient, predating their spaceflight by centuries, and the translators struggled to capture its full meaning. But the essence came through clearly enough. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in our hearts, we do believe we shall overcome someday. It was a song of struggle and hope, of suffering and perseverance, of the long march toward better days. It was humanity's story, distilled into music, shared with beings who had walked their own version of the same path. And as the human voices faded into the void, Vexthor realized that the galaxy had not just gained a powerful ally. It had gained a reminder of what civilization could be when it chose hope over despair, when it chose to help rather than hurt, when it chose to answer the call of strangers in the darkness. Standing on the observation deck of his flagship, watching the human dreadnoughts hold their formation like eternal guardians, Vexthor thought about the future for the first time in 3 centuries without feeling the weight of impending doom. The war was over. The Devourers were destroyed. The galaxy would rebuild. And humanity, those strange beings who had crossed 300 years of void to help strangers, would be part of that rebuilding. They had arrived as saviors, but they would stay as friends. And perhaps, Vexthor thought, that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of the Devourers, but the discovery that even in a galaxy full of darkness, there were still beings willing to carry light across impossible distances, across generations, across the void itself, just because someone, somewhere, had asked for help. The celebration had been premature that day a year ago, when the champagne had flowed and the coalition had believed itself victorious. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps that moment of joy, shattered as it was by the revelation of lingering danger, had been necessary to create space for something better. The true victory wasn't in defeating the Devourers alone. It was in discovering that they didn't have to fight alone. That help could come from unexpected places. That promises made across the stars could be kept, even if they took 3 centuries to fulfill. And as the human civilian convoy continued its journey, still decades away but inexorably approaching, carrying 2 million beings who had been born to help strangers they'd never met, Vexthor allowed himself something he hadn't felt in 300 years: hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the genuine hope of thriving. The hope that the galaxy that emerged from the ashes of war would be better than what came before. The hope that humanity's example, their dedication, their sacrifice, their unwavering commitment to helping others, would inspire the coalition to be better, to do better, to build something worth the cost that had been paid to preserve it. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the concerns of mortal beings. But among those stars, in ships and stations and rebuilt worlds, a new story was being written. A story of different species working together. A story of promises kept across impossible distances. A story of darkness defeated not just by weapons, but by the simple, profound decision to help each other. And at the heart of that story, forever, would be the memory of the day the Galactic fleet celebrated victory, and Earth's dreadnoughts appeared, not to conquer, not to claim, but to fulfill a promise 300 years in the making. Because they were human. And it's what they do.